Hey guys, welcome back to another Wednesday, and I'm glad to be here. Glad you guys are here, and I just want to share some stuff about the Israelites, going back to the Old Testament a little bit, looking at God's chosen people. So the Israelites were God's chosen people, and they really had this up and down relationship with God. You know, they'd come to him, then they'd fall away from him, then they'd come to him, then they'd fall away from him, then they'd come to him, fall away from him. It was like this thing over and over and over and over again. And every time they'd come back to him, things would get good, or at least better. But every time they'd fall away from him, they would definitely get worse. I mean, they found themselves in situations where they were slaves, where they were famines, where they were just separated, where things weren't very good for them. And this is where we cue our deliverer. Now, when you think of heroes in the Bible, the picture that might come to mind is that someone who has their stuff together, or at least pretends to have their stuff together. But that's not always the case. In fact, it's very rarely the case that they have their stuff together. And today, I want to introduce to you Samson. You might have heard this name, you might have not heard this name, but you can read about him in Judges 13 through 16, which we're going to kind of do an overview of because his life is pretty interesting, and I just think it gives some takeaways for us and how to deal with this, or how to talk about it, or just fun stuff that we get to read about. Now, the book of Judges is already a pretty crazy book, because the book of Judges is really about this downward spiral about God's chosen people and how they keep going down and down and down, getting further and further away from him, that they're just not doing things the way that they ought to be doing. So let me give you a little backstory of how we actually get to this downward spiral. So the Israelites are delivered from Egypt, where they were, let my people go, Moses and the 10 Commandments, all that stuff is happening. And so they leave Egypt and they're going to the promised land. Moses is leading them, but then Moses dies. And so Joshua takes over and they finally reach the promised land. The only problem is the promised land is already filled with people. And these people just aren't ordinary people. These are very, very wicked people. The Canaanites, who are practicing things like child sacrifices. And not only that, they're really, really immoral. I mean, they're practicing child sacrifice. So you can only imagine the things that they were doing. So Joshua leads everybody into battle to drive these Canaanites out, which they do for the most part. I mean, there are some people who turn to God, and there are some people who say, I'm on your side, and they do a good job of driving out the Canaanites. But then fast forward, Joshua's really, really old and he's about to die. And basically what he says to these people is, listen, you got to stay close to God, because if you don't, you'll stray, things will get bad. Stay close to God. And now we get into the book of Judges, which, from what I've said before, it's their downward spiral. And as you can guess, they didn't stay close to God. And when I say judges, I don't want you to think about law and order type of judges. I want you to think like military leader type of judges. And Samson was one of those guys, a military leader. I mean, you might know him for his strength. And even before Samson was born, he really did already have an interesting life. So Samson's parents couldn't have kids. They were barren. And then one day his mom gets a visit from an angel, which of course is always crazy enough already. But this angel tells his mom that you're going to have a kid, but he's going to be a Nazarite, which means he's going to be devoted to God. So this is what I need you to do. And this angel tells his mom, says, listen, you can't eat unclean food. You can't drink wine, which is already a bad thing if you're pregnant, but you also can't drink anything fermented or anything like that. And so the mom's like, okay, I'll do it. And so the mom goes to the dad, and the dad's like, what are you talking about? An angel came to visit you? Not too sure about that. So the next day, the same angel comes and visits her, and she runs and gets her husband and says, listen, the man that told me all this stuff about being pregnant and not doing this and not doing that, and my son's gonna be a Nazarite, he's back. Let's go see him. And so the dad goes over, and the dad doesn't know what's going on, and so he's talking to this angel, and he's like, okay, what's the deal here? And the angel says the same thing and says, listen, you're going to have a son, and your wife's going to not have to eat, unclean things and not drink wine and do all this stuff, because he's going to be a Nazarite. And so the guy's like, cool. What's your name so that we can sacrifice something to you? And the angel's like, no, like, it wouldn't even make sense to you if I told you my name. Like, you need to look at God. And so, the dad's like, okay, well, we'll do some type of sacrifice to God. And so, they do this thing and the angel disappears. And when the angel disappears, the dad finally gets it. And he's like, oh my gosh, we're doomed. That's literally what he says. He gets so like flustered. He's like, oh my gosh, we're going to die. Like that was just an angel of God. Like we're going to die right now. And the wife, again, being the wife, trying to calm him down, talk him off the ledge and be like, listen, if the angel wanted us dead, don't you think we would have been dead by now? Just saying, he was an angel. Oh, wow, Queenie. Show Mama. Yeah, that's mine. Go show Mom. I love you, Queenie. I love you, Queenie. What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? Stinking kids. But bam, Samson is born and he's the real deal. I mean, this is a guy who can rip city gates off of its hinges with his bare hands or tear a lion in two with his bare hands. This guy is crazy. He's like the real man of steel. But the thing about his brute strength is that he might be really, really strong, but sometimes it seems like he's not really, really smart. In fact, when you read through these chapters and you read through his life, you see that he's filled with promiscuity and violence and rage, and he just got a lot of issues. So Judges 13, you read about his birth. Judges 14, you read about when he comes in contact with his first wife. He's found this really hot babe of a Philistine woman. And if Philistine sounds familiar, well, it might sound familiar because, I don't know, have you ever heard of the story of David and Goliath? Well, Goliath was a Philistine. The Philistines were trying to kill all the Israelites. And this girl that he wants to marry is a Philistine. The Philistines thought the Israelites were dumb and wanted to mock their God day and night. Day and night. So of course his parents are like, can't you find any other girl in the entire land to marry? But he's like, nah, this is the girl. She's perfect. She's the one for me. And so he goes and tries to make it happen. You see him traveling down to her hometown where he says, I'm going to go and talk to her. She doesn't know it yet, but she will be my wife. Kind of like a Gaston type of thing from Beauty and the Beast, but a little bit different. But on the way there, a lion attacks him or tries to attack him. And this is what it says. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as he might have torn a young goat. Pretty intense, right? Well, fast forward, he talks to this young girl. He starts to make things happen. Now he's traveling back to her hometown for the actual wedding day. And guess what he comes across? He comes across the rotting carcass of this lion that he just ripped apart. Now, here's the interesting question for you. I don't know if anyone has ever told you, but it's not good to eat from a rotting carcass. Maybe no one told Samson, but he goes to this rotting carcass and he sees that there have been some bees who have made a hive there, and he steals or takes, however you want to define it, he takes the honey. And now he goes to this wedding and he meets his groomsmen there. And he says, listen, groomsmen, I got a riddle for you guys. And these groomsmen are a bunch of Philistines. They're not like friendly, or they're not his friends, but they're just people that they were appointed to be his groomsmen. He says, I got this riddle for you. And let's make a little bet. You have 7 days to solve this riddle, and if you can't solve this riddle, you owe me 30 pieces of linen clothing and 30 pieces of like clothes or whatever. And you make this bet. And he says, if you can't solve it, that's what you owe me. But if you do solve it, I'll give that to you. And so they have 7 days to figure this out. By day 3, by day 4, they can't figure it out. So what do? What any normal person would do, right? They go and threaten his new wife. They say, listen, new wife of Samson, we need to figure out this riddle or we're going to be out a lot of money. So this is what's going to happen. You figure it out or we're going to burn you and your father's house. Which is it? So as you can imagine, that's a pretty heavy threat. And so she goes to her new husband and says, listen, you got to tell me what's going on. What's the answer to this, riddle? Do you not really love me? And so after 7 days, and so this is like, 6 days, 23 hours and 50 minutes or something like that, he gives her the answer and she runs to these groomsmen and says, here's the answer. Don't harm me or my family. And of course, they find out the answer and they go to him and they say, here's the answer. And Samson's like, yeah, you guys only got it by threatening my wife. And it's kind of interesting what he says. He calls her a calf not a calf, he calls her a cow of some sort, which is kind of something you shouldn't call your wife. And so guess what? He has to pay these guys, but instead of forking out the money, he goes to another town, beats up 30 guys, takes everything they have, and hands it over to these 30 groomsmen. But he's so angry that he doesn't go back to his wife's house. He goes to his father's house. And while he's at his father's house, why can't I think of the words to say this? His wife is given to one of his groomsmen, one of the guys who won the bet. He's not going to be happy about this, as you can probably imagine. You know, this father-in-law of Samson is a pretty sneaky guy, and things probably aren't going to end well for him because, I mean, who does that? Who says, here's my wife or here's my daughter that I just gave to this guy. Now I'm going to go behind his back and give them to one of the groomsmen. And when Samson comes back, well, I'm going to offer him my other daughter. And that's exactly what happens. Samson finally comes back to his wife, and, you know, the father-in-law is hiding that wife. And he's like, listen, she's busy. How about, though, you marry my younger daughter? Isn't she very pretty? And so Judges 15 is all about that story, all about that event. And he's like, no, I married a girl and I want to bring her home with me as my wife. Now, where is she? And he's like, well, she's kind of someone else's wife right now. And so you can imagine Samson kind of being already a hothead, did not like this. And what does he do? Again, what any rational, normal person would do. He finds 300 foxes, ties their tails together, puts a torch in between them, and sends them off to the crops. My first question is, where do you find and how do you find 300 foxes? Fox eye. A lot of fox. Second question is, how do you tie their tails together? Third question is, I can't even imagine what that looks like to tie the fox tails together, put a torch in between them. Doesn't matter. What he ends up doing is he sends these foxes with the torches in between their tails into their crops, burns all of the Philistines' crops down. The Philistines get word of who did this. The people say, look, it's Samson, Samson, Samson. The guy who just married this guy's daughter, yeah, that's who it is. And so what do the Philistines do? Again, what any normal person would do. They go to that new wife and her father, and they kill him. Again, Samson is probably not going to be happy about this. He hasn't even, had a chance to hang out with his wife because she's been married to another guy. She's been hiding and now she's dead. So now with everybody seeking revenge on everybody else, you can read what happens next. Again, this is Judges chapter 15. But to give you a little hint, it involves betrayal, a jaw of a donkey bone, and the Philistine army. Now, like I said, the book of Judges is all about Israel's downward spiral. And Samson is no different. He's on his way down. He's not getting any better. So this just happened, and there's a 20-year span of him being in charge, of him being the leader. And then we jump into Judges chapter 16, where we find him, again, doing the best thing possible. No, he's not doing the best thing possible. He's actually caught with a prostitute. And so he's surrounded. People know where he's at, they know where he's lying, and they devise a plan to kill him. But what happens is, again, this guy is brutally strong. And what do you do with a guy this strong? Well, you can't really do much, because what Samson does is that he gets up and he rips off the city gates. Again, we ask the question, what do you do with a guy who can rip off city gates with his bare hands? There's not much he can do. So we're coming to the end of Samson's life, and he finally falls in love with this lady named Delilah. Now, Delilah finds the secret of Samson's strength. She gets it out of him. And this kind of shows his arrogance, that he thinks he's invincible, that nothing can actually hurt him, that nothing can penetrate him, that he's just indefeatable. But we find out that he's not. She finds out the secret, tells the Philistines gather him up, and, well, it doesn't end too well for anybody. And this is the part that I want you guys to read a little bit about, because you really read about his arrogance. You find that, he's a little into himself, that he thinks he's invincible. But to give you a little taste of what actually goes down, you will read about eyes being gouged out and just pillars falling down onto people. So I encourage you to read that. That's Judges chapter 16. Samson wasn't a very good guy, and you can read that from a lot of his different interactions with people, that he had anger, that he had problems, that he had, just issues in life. And you might read, Samson's story and think, well, doesn't God condone all that? I mean, he filled him with his spirit to do some of these things. And while he did do that, you have to know that God doesn't stand for everything that Samson did. God was for the people. And really, when you have that many people with doing so many bad things in this downward spiral, sometimes you just have to work with what you have. And this is what God is doing, that he's working with what he has. But he's always been and always will be for the people. So if all God has is this guy who's super, super strong and has this strength, and he has some anger issues and he has some bigger issues than that, well, God's going to use him. God's going to use him to ultimately protect the people and get them out of trouble. And so sure, you have this guy Samson who takes riddles far too serious, and he takes being cheated far too serious, and he's pretty arrogant about his strength, and he's pretty arrogant about being invincible, but God will use that. And I want you to, be encouraged by that even in those dark times that you face in life, even in those moments where you feel like, how can God use me? Just look at Samson and say like, well, God can use someone like that, then God can definitely use someone like me. And know that God is always for his people. So I hope that you had fun kind of revisiting the story of Samson, and that, you go back and read those little details of like really interesting battles and interesting people. And so love you guys, miss you guys, and be blessed. Bye.